On the evening of September 8, 1944, the residents of Chiswick, a quiet suburb of London, were preparing for dinner. By this point in the war, the British people were experts in the sounds of destruction. They knew the drone of the German bombers. They knew the buzzing rattle of the V-1 flying bombs, the so-called doodlebugs. They knew that when the engine cut out, you had seconds to take cover before the explosion. But on this particular evening, there was no drone. There was no buzzing. There was no warning siren. At one moment, there was silence. In the next moment, a crater 30 feet deep appeared in the middle of the street. 3 people were dead, and houses were reduced to rubble. It was only after the explosion, seconds later, that the sound caught up, a double crack of thunder echoing across the city. This was the world's introduction to the V-2 rocket. It was a weapon that traveled faster than the speed of sound. It arrived before it was heard. It was a ghost. To the people of London, it seemed like magic, or perhaps a curse from the sky. But to the Allied intelligence officers, it was a terrifying realization. The Germans had developed a ballistic missile capable of touching the edge of space. But the most disturbing secret of the V-2 was not how it flew, or how it was guided. The darkest secret was where it was born. While the rockets rained down on London and Antwerp, the factory that built them was nowhere to be found on any reconnaissance map. It was not in a city. It was not in an industrial park. It was invisible. To find the birthplace of the space age, we must travel to the heart of Germany, to the Harz Mountains. We must look at a lonely hill known as the Konstein. And we must go inside. This is the story of the Mittelwerk, the Devil's Workshop. The story begins with a failure. For years, the German rocket scientists, led by the brilliant and controversial Werner von Braun, had tested their weapons at Peenemünde, a research facility on the Baltic coast. It was an open-air facility, scientific and orderly. But in August 1943, the British Royal Air Force found it. In a massive bombing raid, they shattered the illusion of safety. The Nazi leadership, including Heinrich Himmler and the SS, made a decision. The vengeance weapons were too important to be destroyed by bombers. They needed a roof that no bomb could penetrate. They needed to move the entire production line underground. They chose the Konstein Hill because of its geology. It was composed of anhydrite, a type of gypsum. It was soft enough to dig, but strong enough to hold a tunnel. Inside the hill, there was already a small storage facility for oil. But what the Nazis planned was not a storage closet. It was an industrial city buried in the rock. The scale of the engineering was staggering. They blasted 2 main parallel tunnels, known as Tunnel A and Tunnel B. Each one was over a mile long, curving gently through the mountain like the barrels of a giant shotgun. Connecting these 2 main arteries were 46 smaller cross-tunnels, creating a grid that looked like a ladder. It was the largest underground factory in the world. But who would build it? And who would work the machines? The German labor force was depleted by the war. So, the SS turned to their vast network of concentration camps. They created a new camp nearby, known as Dora. The men sent to Dora were not treated as workers. They were treated as biological components of a machine, components that were expected to wear out and be discarded. In the early months of the project, there were no barracks. The prisoners did not march to the factory, they lived inside it. Thousands of men, Russians, Frenchmen, Poles, political prisoners, were herded into the tunnels. They slept in the cross galleries, on lice-infested straw, surrounded by the deafening noise of jackhammers and the dust of blasting. The environment inside the mountain was hellish. The air was cold and damp, constantly hovering around 8 degrees Celsius. But the air was also filled with the white dust of the gypsum rock. It coated everything. It coated the machinery, the tools, and the lungs of the prisoners. Men coughed up white paste. They died of pneumonia, tuberculosis, and sheer exhaustion, never seeing the light of day for weeks at a time. And yet, in the middle of this prehistoric squalor, something futuristic was taking shape. If you walked down the main tunnel in 1944, you would see a sight that defied logic. On one side, you had starving men in rags, beaten by SS guards with rubber hoses. On the other side, you had the most advanced technology on the planet. The V-2 rocket, or the AGGR-EGAT-4 as the scientists called it, was a masterpiece of precision engineering. It stood 46 feet tall. It was guided by gyroscopes that had to be perfectly balanced. It was fueled by liquid oxygen and alcohol, pumped by a turbo pump that was a marvel of fluid dynamics. These rockets were not being built by robots. They were being assembled by hand. The prisoners, many of whom were educated men, engineers, and mechanics before the war, were forced to wire the guidance systems and weld the fuel tanks. The irony was blinding. The SS demanded perfection. A loose screw or a bad weld could cause the rocket to explode on the launch pad. Sabotage was the greatest fear of the German engineers. And indeed, sabotage happened. Prisoners would urinate on the wiring to cause corrosion that wouldn't be detected until weeks later. They would loosen bolts in the deepest parts of the engine. It was a quiet, desperate resistance. The penalty for sabotage was death by hanging. The cranes used to lift the rockets were often used as gallows. The other prisoners were forced to watch the executions beneath the shadow of the missiles. Werner von Braun and his team of scientists visited the factory often. After the war, many of them claimed they didn't know the extent of the horror. They claimed they were men of science, looking only at the blueprints, blind to the human misery standing next to the workbench. But the layout of Mittelwerk makes that claim hard to believe. You could not walk from the entrance to the assembly line without stepping over the bodies of the dead and the dying. The smell of the tunnels was a mixture of rocket fuel, excrement, and death. It was unavoidable. By 1945, the factory was churning out hundreds of rockets a month. They were loaded onto trains inside the mountain, covered in camouflage, and shipped to launch sites in Holland and Western Germany. But the war was closing in. The roar of the V-2s over London could not stop the Allied armies advancing on the ground. In April 1945, the American 3rd Armored Division and the 104th Infantry Division pushed into the Harz Mountains. They were looking for the source of the rockets. What they found was beyond their comprehension. When the American soldiers arrived at the entrance of the tunnels, the SS guards had largely fled. The camp at Dora was liberated, but the scene was apocalyptic. Bodies were stacked like cordwood. The survivors were walking skeletons, too weak to cheer. But then, the soldiers turned on their flashlights and entered the mountain. The photos taken on that day are surreal. American GIs, holding their rifles, standing next to rows and rows of sleek, black and white rockets. It looked like a scene from a science fiction movie set in a dungeon. They found vast halls filled with jet engines for the new fighter planes. They found blueprints for intercontinental missiles that could hit New York. They found the future of warfare, packed in grease and waiting for assembly. The intelligence officers who arrived next were stunned. They realized that the Germans were years ahead of the Allies in rocketry. This discovery triggered a new kind of race. It wasn't a race to destroy the factory, it was a race to steal it. The Americans knew that the Harz Mountains were in the zone assigned to the Soviet Union for post-war occupation. They had only a few weeks before the Red Army would arrive to claim the territory. So, the U.S. Army launched a frantic operation. They didn't just take the documents. They took the rockets. They loaded hundreds of railcars with V-2 parts, engines, and guidance systems. They packed up the entire contents of the Devil's Workshop and shipped it west, eventually to the United States. They also took the mines. Werner von Braun and his top team surrendered to the Americans, bringing with them the knowledge of how to reach the stars. The Soviets arrived in July. They found the mountain empty. The Americans had scooped out the technological heart of the facility, leaving only the empty shell and the tragic history of the camp. There is a grim statistic that haunts the legacy of the V-2 rocket. It is the only weapon system in history that killed more people during its production than it did in its operation. Approximately 5,000 people were killed by V-2 attacks on London, Antwerp, and other cities. But in the tunnels of the Kohnstein and the barracks of Dora, an estimated 20,000 prisoners died. They died of starvation, disease, execution, and exhaustion. For every rocket launched, 4 men died building it. Today, we look back at the Saturn V rocket that took Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin to the moon. We marvel at the fire and the majesty of the launch. We celebrate it as the pinnacle of human achievement. But if you strip away the white paint of the Saturn V, if you look at the fundamental design of the engine and the pumps, you find the DNA of the V-2. You find the fingerprints of Werner von Braun. And if you look even closer, into the shadows of history, you find the ghosts of the Mittelwerk. The space age was not born in a sterile laboratory in Florida or Houston. It was born in the dark, suffocating tunnels of a German mountain, built by slaves who were worked to death to create a weapon of terror. The tunnels are still there today. The entrances are gated, and the bats have replaced the workers. The damp air still eats away at the rusting metal parts left behind in the mud. It is a silent memorial. It serves as a brutal reminder that technology is not inherently good or evil. It is a tool, and in the hands of a regime without a conscience, the pathway to the stars can be paved with the suffering of the innocent. As we stare up at the night sky and dream of Mars and beyond, we must never forget the heavy price that was paid for the first step on that journey. We must remember the Devil's Workshop. Thank you for watching this chapter of our history. The story of World War II is filled with these uncomfortable truths, and it is our duty to explore them. If you want to support this channel and see more documentaries like this, please subscribe. Until next time.